They were legends, knighted, praised, immortalized on screen. But behind the curtain, arrogant, cruel, impossible. This isn't about scandals or crimes. It's about ego, ice-cold stares, and the kind of sarcasm that could end careers. These 21 classic British actors were the royalty of stage and screen, and, reportedly, the worst jerks you'd ever meet. Revered by millions, feared by coworkers, loved for their talent, hated for their temperament. Welcome to the velvet-draped battlefield of old British cinema, where the tea was hot, but the insults were hotter. Before we dive headfirst into the madness, make sure you're subscribed for more deep dives into the beautiful, bizarre, and often brutal world behind the spotlight. Drop a comment and let us know. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now in your corner of the world? Let's see who's out there, awake with us in the shadows. 1. Laurence Olivier. It's always the geniuses, isn't it? Laurence Olivier was what you might call the human embodiment of a cathedral. Majestic, cold, and prone to casting shadows over lesser men. He redefined Shakespeare on screen and stage, earned every accolade the industry could create, and, according to many, treated fellow actors like disposable scenery. Olivier had a habit of calling people darling in a tone that made it sound like an insult. To be young, hopeful, and within his radius was to risk annihilation by sarcasm. His greatest weapon wasn't a sword, it was a glance, or worse, a pause. He once reportedly told a struggling actor mid-rehearsal, "Try acting, dear boy, it's much easier," a line often misattributed to others but so quintessentially Olivier in its sneer that it hardly matters who really said it. The man could dismantle your self-worth with a single breath. And if he deemed you theatrically beneath him, God help you. His legendary rivalry with Marilyn Monroe on The Prince and the Showgirl set became tabloid meat, but behind closed doors, it was colder, sharper, and far more vicious. Her insecurity amused him. Her method acting bored him. He wanted control. She wanted empathy. Neither got what they wanted. In public, Olivier was elegance incarnate. In private, some said he was a man who mistook intimidation for leadership. You didn't work with him, you survived him. But of course, genius excuses all, right? Or at least delays accountability until everyone's too dead to care. And speaking of sharp tongues dressed in silk suits, Sir John Gielgud was waiting in the wings with a wit so blistering it made Olivier look merciful. 2. John Gielgud. John Gielgud didn't yell. He didn't fight. He didn't drink himself into volcanic moods. What he did instead was far worse. He commented, quietly, devastatingly, with the precision of a fencing master who didn't need to lunge, only lift an eyebrow. Gielgud was theater royalty, an actor so refined he made other actors feel like commoners just by entering a rehearsal room. His voice was often described as molten silver, though some who worked with him might compare it more to cold mercury, beautiful, toxic, and hard to pin down. To be the target of his sarcasm was to endure a humiliation so elegant you almost thanked him afterward. Almost. There's a story about Gielgud being introduced to a young actor who eagerly proclaimed, "Sir John, I'm playing Hamlet," to which Gielgud reportedly replied, "How brave of you," then walked away. The man could distill a full character assassination into 4 syllables. Even his compliments sounded like warnings. He had little patience for incompetence, and even less for self-importance, unless it was his own. He was known to recite his own reviews at dinner parties, not to boast, but as if re-entering the scene of a crime he hadn't been properly thanked for. When asked how he handled fame, he once quipped, "Oh, I've never minded being called a genius. It's rather pleasant." Unlike Olivier, who projected volcanic dominance, Gielgud's tyranny came in the form of polite horror, like being chastised by an elegant ghost. Even his letters could ruin your week. One actor described receiving a note from him post-performance. "You were very brave to attempt that role. I hope you are resting now." But while Gielgud's weapon was words, Richard Burton's was volume, drunken, thunderous, and always loaded. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not afraid of a little behind-the-scenes bitterness. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more where this came from. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you hearing these stories over morning coffee, or at 2 a.m. deep in the spiral with us? 3. Richard Burton. Richard Burton didn't enter rooms. He crashed into them. A thundercloud in tailored tweed, wielding a voice that could make grocery lists sound like scripture. Off stage, however, the poetry often turned to poison. Burton's reputation was a cocktail of genius, arrogance, and barely suppressed chaos. He drank like it was an Olympic event and treated conversation like a contact sport. His friends were terrified of him. His enemies didn't last long enough to comment. When sober, he could be thoughtful, even kind. But those moments were rare enough to be mythologized. Most remember the Burton who barked orders at directors, insulted actors mid-scene, and referred to scripts as suggestions at best. On the set of Cleopatra, he famously insulted everyone from lighting crew to makeup artists with Shakespearean flair. His contempt wasn't loud, it was operatic, and it wasn't just the industry that caught his wrath. Elizabeth Taylor, the woman he married twice, once said being with him was like sleeping with a loaded gun. He once described himself as a man with the voice of God and the manners of a dock worker. If he hadn't said it, someone else would have. He was brilliant and unbearable, often simultaneously. And though his performances drew ovations, his presence drew exhaustion. Burton didn't suffer fools. He also didn't suffer equals. And he definitely didn't believe in apologies. He walked through life as if each moment owed him an audience. And just when you thought the bar couldn't be any higher or lower, Peter O'Toole would stumble in, drenched in gin and ready to make Burton look like the sensible one. 4. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole lived like life was an improv scene he hadn't rehearsed, and frankly didn't need to. He was the kind of actor who could turn up drunk, charm the furniture, and still deliver a performance that made the critics weep. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the charm thinned, fast. O'Toole didn't hide his disdain for the less talented or the less interesting, which, in his view, was most people. He had an Olympic-level tolerance for alcohol and an allergic reaction to authority. If a director gave him notes, he'd either ignore them completely or mock them with such poetic derision it made bystanders want to flee the set. He was by many accounts a beautiful nightmare, mercurial, magnetic, and maddening. You never knew if he'd turn up to the scene or to the pub across the street. He was once asked how he prepared for a role. He replied, "I read the script and decide which lines I'll bother remembering." The rest, he implied, could be improved by sheer force of charisma. It usually was. But for co-stars and crew, working with O'Toole could feel like being held hostage by brilliance, if the hostage-taker was quoting Byron while setting fire to the set. There was a charm to him undeniably, that wild gleam in the eye, that sense that even he didn't know what he'd say next. But behind the romance was a man who bulldozed boundaries and tested patience like it was a sport. If you weren't enchanted, you were probably exhausted. And just when you thought the wildest man in the room couldn't be outdone, Oliver Reed would burst through the wall like a drunken tornado in a leather vest, demanding to know why nobody was bleeding yet. 5. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed didn't have moods. He had episodes. Entire afternoons that felt like bar fights with soliloquies. He was the kind of man who could win a fistfight in a tuxedo, then lecture you on the decline of British theater with blood on his cufflinks. His acting was raw, visceral, unforgettable. His behavior? Also unforgettable. But not in the way anyone enjoyed. Reed was chaos in human form. He drank as if sobriety were a personal insult and made a habit of turning every film set into a stress test. If a director tried to rein him in, Reed responded like a bear being told to please sit down and use a coaster. Stories of his antics are legion. Brawls in hotel lobbies, public insults hurled with poetic precision, co-stars who refused to work with him a second time. One actor described him as an unpredictable animal wearing a charming man costume. There was a menace to Reed's charisma, like he was always 5 seconds away from transforming into something dangerous. Not because he hated people, but because he found them boring. And if you were boring, he'd let you know, loudly, sometimes by tossing a chair or launching into an improvised whiskey-fueled rant about your haircut. Yet beneath the volcanic temper and unpredictable rages, there was talent. Serious, undeniable talent. When he chose to turn it on, he could mesmerize. But that was the problem. You couldn't predict when that would be, or if you'd get punched in the lead-up. And while Reed was all heat and smoke, Alec Guinness was ice, cold, remote, and surgical in his judgments. You didn't see the cut until you'd already started bleeding. 6. Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness was the sort of man who could kill your spirit with a single raised eyebrow and make you thank him for the experience. Unlike his rowdier contemporaries, Guinness didn't throw things or shout. He just quietly made you feel like you'd failed a sacred test, one you didn't know you were taking. He had the aura of a headmaster who was deeply disappointed that you existed. To fans, he was polite, formally so, but always at a glacial distance. He once allegedly told a young Star Wars admirer that seeing the film again would turn his brain to mush, and then refused to sign another autograph. The child never forgot. Neither did anyone else who found themselves on the business end of Guinness's disapproval. On set, he was surgical, professional, punctual, and according to some, absolutely brutal in his condescension. Younger actors often found themselves shrinking under his stare, fumbling lines not from fear of failure, but from the sheer pressure of his quiet, aristocratic contempt. It wasn't overt. That would have been too messy. Guinness preferred subtle ruin. A sigh, a dry comment, a look that said, "Ah, so that's what passes for acting these days." He wasn't unkind, just uninterested in pretending. If he didn't respect you, you'd know. And if he did, well, he probably wouldn't say it out loud. He was the sort of man who made silence sound like judgment and courtesy feel like exile. There was no fire, no brimstone, just frostbite in velvet gloves. But while Guinness could eviscerate with poise, Rex Harrison came armed with volume, ego, and the uncanny ability to make absolutely everyone feel beneath him. 7. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison didn't just walk into a room, he colonized it. Nicknamed Sexy Rexy by the press, and that absolute bastard by more than one co-star, Harrison wore arrogance the way others wore aftershave. Strong, constant, and completely unapologetic. He had a reputation for class, but it came prepackaged with condescension. If he smiled at you, chances are it was because you weren't talking. Colleagues described him as tyrannical on set, quick to belittle, and almost allergic to collaboration. He was known for interrupting scenes to berate other actors, sometimes in character, sometimes not, and sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. Directors were advised to stay firm or stay quiet. Either way, they rarely won. Julie Andrews, his co-star in My Fair Lady, once said working with him was an experience, which is British for he was a nightmare, but I've signed an NDA. He had no patience for actors he didn't respect, which was most of them. Crew members? Even lower on the hierarchy. His ego filled rooms faster than he did. But of course he was brilliant. That's the dangerous part. He brought gravitas, wit, and a sort of brutal charm to every role. The audience loved him, the critics adored him, and according to some, so did he, deeply. Harrison wasn't the kind of man who left trails of destruction. He left trails of exhaustion. People who were simply worn down from the sheer effort of not offending him, or worse, trying to impress him. And if you thought Harrison was hard to please, Trevor Howard was a man who didn't bother hiding his disdain, because why waste energy pretending you liked anyone? 8. Trevor Howard. Trevor Howard looked like the kind of man who would quietly disapprove of your lifestyle choices and then tell everyone at the pub about them. He played military officers, stoic lovers, and upright gentlemen, often with the same expression he wore off camera, vaguely disgusted and ready to leave. Howard had a reputation for brilliance and for making his colleagues feel like furniture. Sarcasm was his native tongue. Patience was not. He reportedly found rehearsals unnecessary, small talk intolerable, and most actors unbearable. One story goes that he walked off set mid-scene because the lighting offended him. No one was quite sure if he meant the technical lighting or the actor delivering the line. He was known for scathing one-liners that could take the air out of a room. If he respected you, he might insult you less frequently. If he didn't, you'd know. Immediately. There were no warm-ups. He once told a director, "You're lucky I even read the script." The director replied, "You didn't." Howard didn't correct him, but behind the brittle sarcasm and permafrost exterior, there was a craftsman, one who delivered performances of restrained, tightly coiled intensity. Off-screen, however, that restraint rarely translated to warmth. He wasn't cruel for sport, but kindness just didn't seem to occur to him as a necessity. Howard didn't explode. He eroded, slowly wearing down those around him until all that was left was a kind of cold, quiet compliance. And just when you thought that was as dry and cutting as British bitterness could get, along came a young Michael Caine, all swagger and side-eye, ready to sneer his way to the top with a chip on his shoulder and a comeback locked and loaded. 9. Michael Caine, early career. Before he became everyone's favorite Cockney grandfather, Michael Caine was a rising star with the attitude of someone who'd already conquered the industry and couldn't believe it was taking everyone else so long to realize it. Early in his career, Caine was known for his sharp tongue, cutting observations, and an ego large enough to require its own dressing room. He had grown up working class and came into the acting world with zero patience for pretense, which in theory sounds refreshing, until you realize that to young Caine, pretense meant anyone who disagreed with him. He was famously dismissive of method actors, theater snobs, and anyone who tried to give him unsolicited advice. When a director told him to try the scene with more feeling, Caine reportedly replied, "How about you try saying that with more intelligence?" This wasn't a man who suffered fools. He cataloged them, with commentary, and if he felt slighted or bored, you'd know about it halfway through his monologue, usually just before he lit a cigarette and walked off. He wasn't physically volatile, but verbally, brutal. Crew members called him the fastest draw in Pinewood, not with a weapon, but with a one-liner that could shut down an entire room. He wasn't violent, he was efficient. And yet, that attitude came packaged with undeniable screen presence. Charisma by the bucket. When he delivered, he really delivered. But back then, being around Caine meant being in a constant state of bracing for his next verbal slap, or watching him deliver it to someone else. And if young Caine was a streetwise knife in the ribs, Sean Connery was the sledgehammer, smooth, Scottish, and just abrasive enough to make sure you never forgot who was in charge. 10. Sean Connery. Sean Connery carried himself like a man who expected every room to already know who he was, and resented it slightly if they didn't. The original James Bond, the walking definition of cinematic cool, also had a reputation for brusqueness sharp enough to take paint off the walls. Crew members often described him as direct, which is the polite industry euphemism for, don't ask him anything unless you're ready for the answer. And Connery always had an answer. He disliked inefficiency, small talk, and, allegedly, anyone who interrupted him mid-thought. Directors who tried to offer too much instruction often found themselves on the receiving end of what one colleague called the Connery glare, a silent but unmistakable message. I was Bond before you graduated high school. Even interviewers weren't safe. Connery was known for snapping back at awkward questions with such controlled phrasing that the insult almost sounded philosophical. His public persona was confident. His private reputation, depending on who tells the story, ranged from intensely focused to outright intimidating. But beneath the steeliness was a craftsman who believed deeply in precision, of line, of performance, and occasionally of criticism. And if someone didn't meet that standard, Connery didn't waste his time hiding his disappointment. Still, for all his gruffness, Connery had a presence that transcended rudeness. People forgave him, or at least understood him, because he radiated a kind of mythic inevitability, as if he wasn't being unkind, merely correcting the universe. And yet, Connery's rough edges pale beside the next man, whose mood swung like a chandelier in a haunted house, a performer whose emotional weather changed without warning and usually brought thunder with it. 11. John Hurt. John Hurt was a paradox. Soft-spoken one moment, volcanic the next. A performer of staggering emotional depth, he carried an inner storm that never fully settled. Colleagues often walked on eggshells around him, not out of fear of malicious intent, but because they never knew what version of Hurt would appear on any given day. Some days he was generous, funny, and reflective. Other days he was curt, cutting, and impossible to approach. Much of his rumored difficulty stemmed from intensity, the kind of intensity that doesn't turn off when cameras stop rolling. He had little tolerance for laziness, studio meddling, or what he reportedly called actors who pretend to suffer instead of simply acting. That line alone should tell you everything about how gently he handled younger colleagues. When stressed or irritated, Hurt's tongue could sharpen with startling speed. A poorly delivered line, a noisy grip, a director fumbling for words. These could bring out a flash of sarcasm so swift and precise it felt like being swatted by a velvet whip. And though he was no stranger to long nights and hard living earlier in his career, it was his mind more than his habits that created friction. Restless, impatient, endlessly searching for honesty in a profession built on pretending. Yet, for all the rumored mood swings, Hurt left behind a legacy of performances so raw and human that even those stung by his remarks often spoke of him with reverence. His difficult side was inseparable from his brilliance, two threads of the same fraying rope. But if Hurt was an unpredictable storm, the next man was a cold front made human. He didn't shout, he didn't fume. He simply dismissed the world with a glance. A master of the quiet insult, wrapped in restraint and just enough charm to make you doubt you'd been insulted at all. 12. Alan Bates. Alan Bates was the kind of actor who could make silence feel like judgment. Not loud, not theatrical, just deeply, almost spiritually unimpressed by most of the people around him. Bates was admired for his emotional subtlety on screen, but off-screen he was often described as aloof, impatient, or openly disdainful of anything he considered mediocre. And the list of things he considered mediocre was long. He was a master of the polite, devastating remark. A director might proudly explain a scene's symbolism, only for Bates to respond, "Yes, yes, but shall we discuss something useful?" Delivered with a faint smile and a gaze that traveled straight through you to a more interesting dimension. If a co-star asked too many questions, Bates reportedly drifted into a quiet, pointed silence, the kind that communicated, with surgical precision, "Please stop speaking." Younger actors seeking his guidance often found themselves gently, or not so gently, brushed aside. Rumor has it he once told an eager newcomer, "Acting is listening. You seem to be doing everything but." The poor soul spent the rest of the production listening so hard he barely breathed. Bates wasn't cruel. Not exactly. He simply lived in an artistic world where excellence was oxygen and anything less was suffocating. His standards were high, his patience thin, and his tolerance for ego remarkably low, unless, of course, it was his own. But if Bates was a cold, quiet storm of superiority, the next man was its opposite, loud, fiery, and gloriously unmanageable. A talent so brilliant and so explosive that even legends crossed the street to avoid getting caught in his gravitational pull. 13. Nicole Williamson. Nicol Williamson was the kind of actor who could bring down the house, or set it on fire, often both. A brilliant performer with a volcanic temper, Williamson's career was one long, winding, high-wire act of genius colliding with self-destruction. To say he was difficult is like calling a hurricane a bit windy. Colleagues didn't work with Williamson so much as survive him. He famously walked off stage mid-performance. He slapped a fellow actor during a curtain call. He once insulted a Broadway audience so savagely, even the orchestra paused. And through it all, the performances remained magnetic, raw, unfiltered, and frequently terrifying. One critic called him Shakespearean danger incarnate, a phrase that perfectly captured his blend of grandeur and volatility. Directors tried to contain him. They failed. Co-stars tried to understand him. Most gave up. He was passionate, impulsive, and allergic to the idea of compromise. When he respected you, he could be generous and even charming. But the respect had to be earned, and quickly. If it wasn't, he'd let you know, loudly, in front of everyone. Williamson treated rehearsals like battlefields. He thrived on confrontation. To some, that meant artistic integrity. To others, it was just arrogance in a leather coat. The truth probably lived somewhere in between. Either way, his eruptions weren't random. They were principled in his mind. Every outburst, every insult, every ruined take was in service of what he believed acting should be. Even if no one else agreed. But if Williamson was a storm that could sweep in unannounced, the next man was a sledgehammer wrapped in tweed. A performer whose raw charisma came with a fuse, and whose explosions left more than just egos in their wake. 14. Robert Shaw. Robert Shaw didn't enter scenes. He attacked them. A powerhouse actor with a temper to match, Shaw left a trail of phenomenal performances and frayed relationships. Whether on land, The Sting, Sea, Jaws, or Shakespearean Battlefield, he brought a rugged intensity that seemed to leap off the screen. Unfortunately, that same energy extended behind the camera, and not always in constructive ways. Shaw's temper was legendary. On good days, he was intimidating but manageable. On bad days, he could reduce a cast member to silence with a single snarl. His wit was razor-sharp, but his sarcasm bordered on cruel. He had little time for what he saw as mediocrity, and even less patience for actors who coasted on charm instead of craft. "Do the bloody work or don't show up," he reportedly growled at a younger co-star who dared to improvise. The co-star did not improvise again. There's an infamous story from the filming of Jaws, where Shaw's tension with co-star Richard Dreyfuss boiled over into near-constant conflict. Shaw would belittle him between takes, challenge him during scenes, and publicly question his talent. And yet, when the cameras rolled, the chemistry was electric, painfully real. Two men who couldn't stand each other, locked in cinematic brilliance. Shaw was a paradox, a fierce perfectionist who also lived in chaos. His performances felt dangerous because, in many ways, they were. He blurred the line between character and combat, and everyone else just tried to keep up. But even Shaw, for all his brooding and bravado, admitted to moments of regret. The next man rarely did. He was charm-turned-weapon, a gentleman actor who, by his own admission, enjoyed being a monster. 15. Christopher Plummer. Christopher Plummer called himself a booze-hound and a brat in his early days, and that was his version of events. To others, he was brilliant, arrogant, and at times, absolutely insufferable. With a classically trained voice and a devilish smirk, Plummer could deliver Shakespeare like thunder, and an insult like poetry. He charmed audiences and infuriated colleagues, often in the same afternoon. Early in his career, he approached fame with the grace of a wrecking ball in velvet gloves. He loathed the sound of music, mocked it publicly for decades, and referred to it as the sound of mucus. And while audiences adored him as Captain Von Trapp, insiders remember a younger Plummer who rolled his eyes through takes, dismissed co-stars as television level, and demanded rewrites like royalty rearranging the furniture. He was known to belittle directors he didn't respect, which was a fairly long list. One associate director recalled asking him for another take, only to be met with, "Why? I got it right the first time." When Plummer turned on the charm, it was blinding. When he didn't, you were invisible. Yet his ego wasn't blind. He later admitted to his earlier arrogance, calling himself a condescending young bastard. The difference between Plummer and others on this list? He eventually owned his behavior. But while the apology came with age, the damage had already been done across decades of stormy rehearsals and sour press interviews. Still, Plummer's scorn was often delivered with elegance. The next man's contempt came colder, sharper, like a whisper in a freezing room. A man whose bluntness didn't erupt. It just quietly annihilated. 16. James Mason. James Mason had the voice of a velvet dagger and the patience of a man forever 5 minutes late to something important. Suave, cerebral, and meticulously composed on screen, he carried off an air of refinement that made audiences swoon and colleagues wince. Mason didn't scream, he didn't stomp. He simply exuded a quiet, crushing contempt for anyone who failed to match his intellectual or professional standards, which, conveniently, included almost everyone. To be clear, Mason wasn't loud about his arrogance. He was clinical. If you forgot a line, he didn't correct you. He sighed. If you asked him for feedback, he wouldn't give notes. He'd offer condolences. One co-star said speaking to him felt like being graded by a disappointed ghost. It wasn't personal exactly, it was atmospheric. You could feel when James Mason didn't think you were worth his time, and he often didn't. He viewed acting less as collaboration and more as silent competition. And he played to win. Reports from his early career suggest he had little use for pleasantries, and even less for actors who treated the job like anything less than sacred craft. Interviews revealed a man simultaneously self-deprecating and self-important, as if he found his own ego exhausting, but yours intolerable. He rarely raised his voice, but often lowered the temperature of a room. Working with Mason meant treading lightly, not because he'd lash out, but because he might look at you with that cold, impeccably polite expression that said, "You are wasting oxygen." But Mason's brand of elegant frost had nothing on the next man, who didn't just chill a room. He froze it, stared everyone down, and dared them to melt first. 17. Donald Sutherland. Donald Sutherland, though Canadian by birth, built much of his early career in Britain, and built a reputation along with it for being, in a word, intimidating. Tall, gaunt, and surgically sharp in his presence, Sutherland didn't need to yell to dominate a set. He just had to enter it. Directors often found themselves adjusting their tone around him. Actors found themselves adjusting their ambitions. He was known for his intellect and his cutting, bone-dry wit. But that intelligence came with a chill. People who worked with him described a man who could switch from mild to menacing with a single sentence. He wasn't unprofessional. He was just relentlessly, almost aggressively precise. And if someone failed to match his precision, he didn't berate. He dismissed. And he did it in a way that made you question whether you ever belonged in the room. Sutherland had little patience for incompetence and even less for flattery. He once described the business of acting as a war against falseness, which sounds noble until you realize that, to him, most people were losing. Spectacularly. On film, he could shift from warmth to cruelty in the blink of an eye. Off camera, that same volatility hummed just under the surface. He had a way of unsettling people, not through tantrums or outbursts, but through an aura of intellectual superiority paired with a glare that made small talk feel like a moral offense. Still, despite his icy presence, Sutherland remained respected, even admired. But the man who came next didn't just scare colleagues. He insulted them to their faces, drank them under the table, and left a trail of scorched earth that somehow never damaged his star. 18. Richard Harris. Richard Harris was the kind of actor whose talent seemed to rise in direct proportion to the chaos he caused. He was a walking contradiction, poetic and profane, noble and reckless, brilliant and, by nearly all accounts, absolutely insufferable. While others played difficult, Harris made it a lifestyle, and a loud one. On set, Harris was often equal parts electrifying and exhausting. He challenged directors openly, derided co-stars with a smirk, and famously treated interviews like combat sport. If you asked him a stupid question, he'd answer it with a monologue about your intellectual poverty. If you asked a smart one, he'd accuse you of being pretentious. Either way, you lost. He drank hard, lived harder, and made no apologies for his temperament, even when it left fellow actors in emotional triage. He once called a respected director a traffic warden with a camera, and reportedly mocked an entire production crew for their lack of poetic vision during a lighting setup. And yet, when the cameras rolled, he could silence a room with a single line. That's what made Harris so maddening. His talent justified none of his behavior, yet somehow excused all of it. Because for every scene he disrupted, he delivered one that audiences never forgot. He was a self-styled warrior poet in a business that didn't ask for either. And he didn't care. But even Harris, for all his roaring bravado, had moments of charm. The next man? He rarely bothered. He didn't rage or rant. He just stood there, quiet, glacial, and absolutely sure that you weren't worth talking to. 19. Ian Holm. Ian Holm was the kind of actor whose silences spoke louder than most people's entire resumes. Small in stature but towering in presence, he cultivated a professional persona that was as quiet as it was chilling. Holm didn't throw tantrums. He didn't rant. He didn't argue. He simply withdrew, emotionally, socially, and sometimes physically, from anyone he deemed unworthy of his time or talent, which unfortunately included most people. On screen, Holm could radiate warmth or menace with microscopic shifts of expression. Off-screen, he leaned almost exclusively toward the latter. Fellow actors described him as distant, hypercritical, and impossible to connect with. Not because he lacked manners. He was perfectly civil, but his version of civility often felt like a handshake from a statue. Younger cast members who tried to engage him in conversation often received clipped responses, or the classic Holm shrug, a gesture so small and so dismissive, it could end friendships that hadn't even begun. He wasn't a diva. He was a wall. You didn't work with Ian Holm. You worked around him. Some directors admired his precision and quiet intensity. Others dreaded his chilly professionalism, interpreting it as contempt. And maybe it was. Holm once said that most actors were too loud to be honest. It's not hard to guess who he thought the honest ones were. Still, for all his frost, Holm remained revered. He didn't need warmth to command respect. He simply needed presence, and the discipline to never let anyone behind the curtain. But where Holm used distance as defense, the next man used chaos as camouflage. A comic genius with a god complex and a reputation that made producers reach for aspirin before rehearsals even began. 20. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers didn't just play characters. He became them. Unfortunately, so completely that even he often forgot who he was. Widely regarded as a comic genius, Sellers was also infamously erratic, moody, and, according to many who worked with him, utterly impossible to trust. The man who gave the world Inspector Clouseau also gave his collaborators migraines, ulcers, and emotional whiplash. On set, Sellers could be dazzling one moment and catatonically withdrawn the next. Directors called him brilliant but volatile. He was known to quit projects mid-shoot, sabotage scenes he didn't like, or simply refuse to speak if something, anything, offended his sensibilities that day. It wasn't rebellion. It was whim. And his whims ran the show. There was a cruel edge to his humor off camera. He would impersonate colleagues behind their backs, mock technicians to their faces, and issue bizarre, often insulting demands that left even seasoned producers baffled. Some said he used his talent as a shield. Others believed he used it as a weapon. Friends, or the closest thing he allowed to friends, described a man whose emotional radar was permanently scrambled. One day he'd flatter you, the next he'd forget you existed. Praise was always transactional. Kindness was theatrical. And behind it all was the ever-present sense that Sellers didn't just dislike people, he found them tiresome. And yet, his performances remain iconic, timeless, unmatched. But so is the trauma he left in his wake. Still, if Sellers was a storm of fractured identities, the next man was a single, unblinking force of ego, sharp-tongued, short-tempered, and utterly uninterested in whether you could keep up with him or not. 21. Malcolm McDowell. Malcolm McDowell made his name playing dangerous men, and, for a while, audiences couldn't tell where the performance ended. Bursting into fame with A Clockwork Orange, McDowell embodied raw, anarchic charisma. And off-screen, he had plenty of that, minus the charm. At the height of his early fame, he cultivated a reputation as one of the most confident and most caustic actors in the room. He was sharp, he was clever, and he knew it. If you weren't on his level, intellectually, artistically, or conversationally, you'd know within seconds. McDowell had a gift for insults that sounded like compliments until you replayed them in your head an hour later. He could say interesting choice with such lethal undertone it felt like a dismissal wrapped in a riddle. Directors learned quickly. McDowell didn't respond well to control. He liked freedom. Or rather, he liked control his way. And if a scene didn't suit him, he'd let you know, loudly, publicly, not because he was trying to humiliate you, but because, in his view, you'd already done that to yourself by being wrong. He once described his younger self as a bit of a handful, which is like describing a hurricane as mildly breezy. But buried beneath the bravado was a relentless drive. He was always reaching, pushing, testing, and occasionally torching bridges as he went. Even now, McDowell remains a symbol of unapologetic artistic rebellion. But during his early years, it wasn't just the characters who were dangerous. It was the man behind the eyes. And with that, the curtain falls. But not with resolution. Only with the echo of footlights, still flickering with the ghosts of egos past.